So I just got off a plane. I was speaking to a group of judges just yesterday on disinformation with actually Josh Tucker. And just to give you a sense of how my life is progressing these days, from the time I left New York to come here, I now see that one of the top trending stories is that Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg have agreed to a cage match this is not fake news. This actually has happened because Meta has now decided to roll out a competitor to Twitter, something called Threads. And so this has now led to promises from both sides that they will actually fight. And Elon Musk has suggested that they do this in the Octagon in Las Vegas. And so I wanted to, because I'm literally, I'm just reporting the news here. Yeah, we'll see whether it actually happens or not. But part of, I mentioned this story both because I was shocked to see it, but also just to give you a sense of I don't want to call it anarchy, but the shifting of the tectonic plates in Silicon Valley that are happening right now. That there is, in my time, I direct the Cyber Policy Center at Stanford, and along with Sans Po, right, we're part of the Project Liberty Institute now, that things are changing along many dimensions right now, and we frequently have the French ambassador come to Stanford to talk about what's happening in Europe. I'm here to tell you a little bit about what's happening in Silicon Valley, and so this is going to be less of an academic talk, though. Well, I do want to talk about work that I'm doing on the implications of AI for democracy, which I'll talk about at the end. So I want to talk about two things in particular. I've titled this talk, Tech Troubles 3.0. Now you can decide whether we're actually at 3.0 or 4.0 or 5.0 at this point. But I sort of see that the first era of tech troubles in the late 90s, thinking about Microsoft and antitrust issues. In the second big issues with tech troubles around 2015-16 with Facebook, Brexit, the US election. And now we've got a whole nother set of issues that we are dealing with. And this next year is going to be absolutely fundamental to the future of the internet and digital technologies in particular. And so what I'm going to talk about are the companies, the problems, the technology, and the policy developments. That's a lot to cover, and I promise to keep it short because I want to get a lot of comments and discussion. So let me just focus and give you a little update on what's happening in the companies, and then we'll talk about some of the areas that all of us research. So Elon Musk's takeover of Twitter has upset an equilibrium in the social media industry that existed before on many different dimensions. In particular, all of these issues that we've been talking about today, dealing with, say, disinformation or dealing with other kinds of content moderation, there had been a kind of agreement that where the companies had achieved a certain consensus as to how to deal with all kinds of problems online, whether you're talking about disinformation, hate speech, bullying, incitement, and the like. That agreement, that equilibrium has been smashed. Not only on Twitter, where now policies have changed so that that what is allowed on Twitter is different than what happened in the pre-Musk era, but also the decisions that have been made at Twitter have had knock-on effects to the other platforms. There are two reasons for this. One is that the Overton window has now been sort of broadened at Twitter so that certain types of content is now, being allowed there. But so that has led to pressure inside and outside of the companies of places like Meta to reverse course on some of the hard policies that they had on with respect to content moderation. You can see that not only, you can see that in two fora. One is what we're seeing is increasing government pressure on the platforms to retreat in their policies on disinformation. You see that if you're familiar with what's happening with the hearings that are happening in Congress right now, that are pressuring the social media platforms to, in particular, when it comes to disinformation. But also the economic pressures of the last 2 years have led to complete transformations in these companies in the field of trust and safety. Because of the pressures that Meta and others have been facing, and of course, Twitter cut most of its trust and safety staff, you're seeing just a retreat in the kind of basic approach that these companies have taken to trust and safety and content moderation. Lots more to talk about Twitter when I get to the problems. Second, looking what's happening at Meta. The first thing I would say is, if you asked me 6 or 10 months ago when I was here last about what's happening there, we would be talking about the metaverse, right? And that's the real story, that Facebook, now Meta, had pivoted to doing virtual reality. That is still the case. They still see a big future there. But I think that the implications of their shift toward the metaverse and virtual reality has been sort of overstated, that it is still the case that the big blue app, Facebook, is actually doing quite well financially, and that the kind of cannibalization of their main properties has not, but their emphasis on virtual reality has not had the effects that most people think. They're still in a very, sort of powerful position. That their main business actually on Instagram and on Facebook has been growing. They had this terrible stock decrease a year ago, which has recovered substantially since then. But Facebook right now is deciding, and I'll talk about this when I talk about AI, when I talk about Google versus Microsoft. The decision by Facebook in the next few months on whether to open source the Llama, well, they have done this already, but whether to open source the Llama large language model is going to have huge implications for everything that's happening in sort of AI development. Yes, there are other examples, whether you look at the UAE or even here, even at Stanford, we released something called Alpaca, which was a variant on the Llama large language model. But if Facebook does decide to make this sort of the next generation of Llama more public and open source, that's going to have huge implications for the way we think about the future of AI, as well as trust and safety when it comes to AI, because once it's essentially in the wild, as it might be, it'll have huge implications. It also, Facebook would be betting on the implication, what would be the kind of Android model of AI, which is that if they can release this open source environment or this publicly available environment, can they essentially shape the way that other actors are using AI? Third, looking at what's happening, TikTok for many years was not in the news, was not getting the attention that that Facebook and Twitter were getting. Their day of reckoning has now come. In the United States, Montana has banned TikTok, and there's certainly a huge amount of concern at the federal level about the idea that China may have sort of control, particularly over the algorithm and the data of young people in the United States. And so while there is very little that you can see in terms of Democrats and Republicans coming together with respect to tech policy, when it comes to anti-China related tech policy, we might actually see some action there. I will say that there's now a court case challenging these rules, the Montana rules, saying that it violates the free speech rights of users. Fourth, Apple. Apple has become sort of, in many ways, the de facto regulator of the internet because on their decisions with respect to privacy and the App Store have huge implications throughout the industry. And so their decisions with respect to data gathering and have affected the business model of all of these other companies in serious ways. In my discussions with folks at Meta, they say that most of that loss that they experienced, let's say a year or two ago, was due to changes in the App Store and how it affected their advertising. Fifth, something that we're probably not paying a lot of attention to is Reddit. Have people understood what's been happening at Reddit in the last week, right? Reddit's always been sort of below the radar, kind of a sort of cool cousin to these other platforms. But Reddit, this gives you a sense of the dynamics between social media and AI, because what's happened is that Reddit has realized that it has just, in some ways, one of the most valuable properties on the internet to train models, right? To train machine learning, because each one of the subreddits then is an identifiable community that if you want to, for example, as Josh Tucker's done in some great papers, if you want to train a model on hate speech and you want to find a subreddit, right, that or a community that is misogynistic or anti-Semitic, you can find those communities on Reddit, train a model in order to derive certain signals about what people like that will talk about, and then you can use it, in your models all over the internet. But this is something that OpenAI realizes as well, and Anthropic, and all the other all the other AI firms, and so they have been harvesting and training their models on Reddit. And that has now led Reddit to limit the ability of use of their API, which has had huge implications for the users. And so now you've seen, I can't remember the number of Reddits that now have shut down or gone private, or they now designate themselves NSFW, not safe for work, which was sort of supposed to be for like pornography sites. And so there's been a fight between the users of Reddit and the corporate leaders there. Finally, Microsoft is something, is one of those companies that we've always sort of, like I said, they were tech troubles 1.0 in many respects. But Microsoft versus Google is where we're seeing the fight play out in the future of AI and these generative AI. And so Google's bought, because Microsoft bought this large stake in OpenAI, their fights, they are posing what those inside Google see as a potential existential threat to search. Bard is, I think, a poor imitator right now of what you can get with GPT-4, but Google certainly has the resources in order to compete. And so this fight between Google and Microsoft, I think, is emblematic of the future of AI. But what I want to emphasize is how different the topics are that we're talking about today than even 8 months ago when I was here in SciencePo and talking about these issues. Yeah. Well, for some things, right, so this is why Facebook's decision to make it open source is going to be quite important. Now, you can't, the actual training of the large language models is resource intensive, right? Once you have the models available, right, then you download these onto your laptop. And so when you say like that the entry costs are low, the entry costs, like to be something like GPT-4, those are pretty high right now. There's only, let's say, 5 or 6 firms that I think would qualify for something like that. But that's why I think what the open sourcing of these models is going to be quite important, because that's at least the theory behind Facebook's making it broadly available, is that it will be in a very different form than the way that we can access it right now. By the way, I'll say that even I don't even call them open source models, that I think that this is partly true. We have a report that's coming out of the Stanford Internet Observatory this week that looks at the image generation models and how that is posing an existential threat to the regime dealing with child pornography. Because what you're seeing is people are adapting these models that exist for, say, DALL-E and Midjourney and the image generation to then create their own terrible images, which is going to pose a sort of new legal questions as to how you're going to enforce some of these traditional rules that we have. Okay. Now let me just talk about the problems. I already mentioned content moderation, but But the other thing that's happening in the next year is that we have this kind of World Cup of elections around the world, not just in the United States, but also India, Indonesia, European parliamentary elections, Spain obviously coming up. And so at the same time that we are seeing this retreat at the companies with respect to disinformation, hate speech, et cetera, it's in some ways even more important that they be involved, and the pressures on them are going to be intense as we approach the elections. I will say one thing about the US elections, that the teams at these companies that I've used to work with that deal with election integrity have been decimated. Right? There's almost no one there who had been doing it 4 years ago. And so they've lost at least half, if not more, of their people who do this kind of work. And I just also want to emphasize, particularly in the United States, how politicized the issue of content moderation has become. And those pressures that are placed on the companies in the US, right, by the US government or by political actors in the US, are going to have spillover effects worldwide, because it does chill their ability to engage in the kind of moderation that would be relevant to elections. And I should say, it's not just in the US. Obviously, what's happening in India is quite important, where the government has directly regulated their ability to regulate content. Second, I mentioned privacy before with respect to with Apple and how Apple's become the de facto regulator there. Second thing I would say is that the issue of, as you've seen with the Italians' shutdown of ChatGPT, in some ways, one of the biggest wedges in order to regulate the new developments with large language models is to do it through privacy regulation. And so we will see that as the kind of outflanking of a lot of these companies in order to get at those issues. I'll punt on antitrust and competition, because I do think actually that what we're seeing now is an unsettling of the large companies that have been doing this. I mean, even something like OpenAI or Anthropic didn't exist in a significant way. And so that these companies, all of the social media companies, the established players that were working in search and social media, are now becoming AI companies, right? And so the sort of entire frame that we brought to Silicon Valley not too long ago is, I think, being upset by the new technologies. With respect, the one area where I could see actions in the United States has to do with the protection of children. We also released a report on investigation of the existing sort of child pornography and pedophilia problems on the platforms about a week or two ago. And there is finally some bipartisan interest in this. I mention this not because it's a huge problem that all of us, I mean, it is a huge problem, but not a problem that a lot of us study. But if you can get some kind of movement in the United States on, for example, the protection of children, and there has been at the state level. So Utah, for example, has now banned or required parental consent for the use of social media for kids. We'll see whether that lasts through the courts. But if we could get some legislation dealing with protection of children, it's possible that we'll also get some additional riders on that kind of legislation dealing with transparency, and so that we could actually get greater insight into what's actually happening at these companies. I mean, I think I've talked about this at CNSPO before, but I wrote a piece of legislation called the Platform Accountability and Transparency Act, which is about researcher access, but also public disclosure obligations, akin to what you're seeing in the DSA with Article 40, which I'll talk about. I already talked about elections. So now let me just talk about the technologies. So look, you know, Meta continues to be the leader when it comes to VR. I think there's been, on the one hand, you know, kind of reorientation of focus both within that company and elsewhere. I'll say, but as you saw, Apple just released its what I would describe as a computer that you can wear on your head last week, so that the VR wars, I think, have now begun in earnest. I do think one of the things that Apple has shown with its new technology is that the fight over alternative reality is not just going to be taking place with respect to virtual reality, these virtual reality environments, but augmented reality. That at some point in the near future, we'll be able to wear glasses that we'll be walking down on the street with that will sort of supplement our daily lives so that we can see information that adds to our environment. You might also ask, as I often do, what does it mean to police disinformation in virtual worlds, where essentially the world is itself a lie? And so the sort of new challenges that will be posed with respect to content moderation in virtual reality, as social media and virtual reality mix together, are really challenging. And so we're writing a report at Stanford on the sort of the problems, the internal governance solutions, and government regulation that's possibly appropriate when it comes to virtual reality. Notice I haven't even talked about blockchain. A year ago, maybe that's all we would be talking about, right? It's still the case. Some here I know are big blockchain. So consider this a tip of the hat to you. We're experiencing this kind of crypto winter in Silicon Valley and elsewhere. I will say, Sam Bankman-Fried is under house arrest about 200 yards from my office on the Stanford campus. I think that and this is true for the larger Project Liberty efforts, that we're trying to see to what extent will blockchain be integrated into sort of financial contexts, whether it's social media, AI, or otherwise. And I think that that's the way we should be thinking about it, is whether this new technology will be married with these other new technological developments. This includes virtual reality, by the way, so that, I don't see like a new competitor to Facebook and Twitter emerging in a blockchain environment, although that's certainly others are pushing that. But it's alongside these changes with virtual reality and AI. Finally, I've talked enough about generative AI. Let me just move on to the specific area of research that I'm engaging in right now, and that is looking at the democracy problem. Now, I think it is a mistake for us to assume that the problems associated with generative AI are the same problems as with respect to social media. And unfortunately, I think we are bringing the frame to AI that we've established, where we think about it just in terms of disinformation, which is indeed a problem, right? That we're worried about deep fakes, and we're worried about ChatGPT lying to us, worried about the privacy, antitrust issues, and what I'd say the geopolitical rivalries. Is China going to lead on AI? Is the West? Instead, I think we need to kind of open the aperture a little bit when we think about the problems that AI poses for democracy, because what it's going to do, it's going to enhance the ability of all political actors to achieve their goals. Whether you're talking about political advertising and targeting, whether you're talking about voter mobilization or persuasion, whether you're talking about the ability of election officials themselves to regulate and enforce rules in elections. AI is going to be changing all of that. And I do worry that we sort of are still thinking about this, in that OpenAI and Anthropic are just like Facebook and Google of yesteryear, when I think things are changing quite a bit. And in particular, I am concerned about the way that new forms of AI will be used with respect to cybersecurity and cyber warfare. That's something I don't think we've paid enough attention to, at least in our field. Okay. Finally, let me talk about policy issues, and then we can open it up for a discussion. In the United States, like I said, there's very little where we could see some movement. To some extent, maybe with respect to China, to some extent with respect to kids. We're seeing this at the state level, and maybe we'll get some transparency. But pay attention to two Supreme Court cases that will be coming out this year, what are known as the net choice cases. They will have a fundamental impact on the future of the internet, not just in the United States, but potentially worldwide, because of the way the platforms will be responding. Texas and Florida have passed laws that are preventing the platforms from engaging in content moderation with respect to hate speech, basically, and some kinds of disinformation. So, for example, in Florida, it is now legally prohibited to take down any of the speech of a candidate for office. Okay, so you can imagine what that might mean in the context of an election, or to take down anything from a journalistic organization, however we define what a journalist is. The Supreme Court recently, and I'm sure familiar with this because it dealt with the Paris attacks, right? The Supreme Court recently said in Gonzalez versus Google that the platforms are not responsible for violence that might occur as a result of speech that was generated on their platforms. And so that broad immunity has still remained, but there are several justices on the US Supreme Court who are very skeptical of platform power when it comes to regulating speech, echoing back to the issues I was talking about before about the politicization of content moderation in the United States. So if they end up upholding these Florida and Texas laws, that will lead to significant balkanization of the internet, both in the United States, so that you could, and around the world, because what you'll end up seeing is that there's certain types of content that will be prohibited in Europe, but mandatory in Florida. Okay. All right, so I don't need to tell you about what's happening in Europe, but I will only say that what is happening in Europe, it's sort of, Europe is the tail that wags the American dog when it comes to tech regulation, but how the Digital Services Act is enforced, particularly for my purposes, like the transparency provisions and how that is going to, enable sort of greater window onto tech, I think is absolutely critical, but also how these firms are going to engage in these systemic risk analyses and the mitigation strategies is going to have spillover effects, of course, around the world. Finally, just with respect to the AI Act, I personally think there's a missed opportunity here to regulate AI in a more general way as opposed to in a sector-specific way, which is what the AI Act does, though I understand the reason to go in that direction. But Europe's ambitions here are now going to provide the model for the rest of the world. Whether Europe can successfully regulate AI and sort of provide a pathway either for states or for the US government, I think is quite important. President Biden yesterday was out in San Francisco talking to some Stanford professors on the future of AI. And so now it is, something that everybody's talking about. It's also the subject of the new program that we've started at Stanford through Project Liberty that your own Florence Giselle is going to help start next year, which is this program on governance of new and emerging technologies. And so we'll have our report ready by the end of the year. And I'll just have to come back in December to talk about it some more. Thanks.
Good evening. I apologize to everyone for being so late. I heard recently, I spent 8 years at the UN in New York, and I am from California, just a backstory. I heard that the Secretary General is looking at making an agency that's, okay. So I'm interested in the funding of that agency. Sometimes there are countries that are in arrears and a costly thing. Anyway, so I'm interested in anything you have to say about that. Thank you very much.
The Secretary General is right across the way here at CN's Post, so we could, just ask. Well, it'd just be like any other UN, right, where it's going to end up being. Yeah, there's certainly funding. Look, there is a kind of foundational question as to whether you can regulate AI. I don't want to seem like the kind of skeptic, kind of techno-anarchist here a little bit, but what does it mean? First of all, what do we mean by AI and what do we mean by regulation of AI? I think the European approach, given sort of the uncertainty and how best to do this, it makes a lot of sense where you have the industries identifying, particular risks, but once it becomes open source, right? And let alone the fact that and by the way, it is open source now where the UAE has published its own model that you can have access to. It's more along the lines of like GPT-3. It's not quite as good as what you're seeing at OpenAI, but it'll get there, right? That we'll end up with some of these open source models that will be available. And so, what will it mean when all of us have, these capabilities on our laptops? I'll say that one of these papers, but we have a paper that I think just came out from the Stanford Internet Observatory where they tried to mimic Iranian and Chinese disinformation and to see if sort of trained it on actual disinformation, and the model ended up doing better than the original disinformation in terms of persuading people. And so I mentioned that because it's taken so long through the peer review process to get this published that they started with GPT 3 was, and now on their own laptops they're able to basically do what was better than when they were able to trick people with this kind of propaganda. So, but let me emphasize that I do think we need some kind of international treaty when it comes to AI, though I worry about our ability to enforce some of these rules.
Thank you very much. It's super interesting. So I would love to hear your thoughts about the Harari's thesis that it's the end of democracy, first, and second, how do you think about the sort of Matt's idea that, okay, we're going to have improvement in persuasion power of the bad guys and the good guys. So what we expect on the net, and what do we expect generally about the trust in democracy? Thank you.
So this is why I think we need to start thinking about AI in a little different way than we have social media. I mean, we're kind of fitting this new technology into these old cognitive biases or boxes. And so we think that it's like 2016 all over again with AI, but I think that's wrong. That's not to say it's not dangerous. I am particularly concerned on the actual security side when it comes to AI, both cyber and weapons generally. And if you had to sort of map my existential risk, or what they call P-doom, right? That's the area where I'd find it. I actually don't think the disinformation problem is the main democracy problem when it comes to and because I don't think that the production of disinformation has actually been, that the lowering of the cost of production of disinformation, which is principally what we talk about when we think of deepfakes and ChatGPT, I don't think that's been the main barrier for people, receiving disinformation. I think the measures that the platforms have, in assuming they care about disinformation, which is a question, but that the measures that they have to deal with disinformation will actually be applied to new forms of disinformation that are well. Now, I do worry, as Yuval does and others, that what's going to happen, the more ubiquitous that deep fakes are, the less likely that people are going to believe in true news, right? That I think is a legitimate concern. To some extent, I'm not positive that's an AI problem, at least in the United States. I think we're getting there already. And you can see that just in the way that people perceive the January 6th insurrection in the US without deep fakes, right? With the way that those videos have been cut, and if you poll people, you see these divergent views on. But I'm willing to be proven wrong as to how severe the disinformation problem is, but I don't actually think that's where it's going to come. Now, the persuasion issues, micro-targeting, those I think are real. And I think I didn't know what Matt's position was on this, but does that accurately represent that? In any event, that's probably, yeah, that you will get it from both sides, right? And that you will see that like I was saying, all political actors now will have these new abilities, whether it's in advertising or targeting or mobilization. And that's not necessarily a bad thing for democracy, right? But I would focus on those kinds of questions as opposed to whether it's really going to this information marketplace. I mean, this is one of the things, and this goes to some of the papers that were already presented. It is still the case that on Facebook, at most 3% of the average user's newsfeed is news, right? Journalism of anything that we would liberally call news. And of that, a tiny fraction is going to be what we call fake news, right? Or disinformation. Now, the problem, the fake news problem, in my estimation, is really about the tails of these distributions. So the question might not be the average user of Facebook. It's the 5 to 10% of whether, super consumers or super spreaders of disinformation. Many of these folks we know also from YouTube studies are people who opt into these. Right? They're looking for it as opposed to being force-fed this kind of information as kind of passive view.
Hi, I would just like to add maybe 2 ideas and get your thoughts on that. For one, maybe the idea of, I don't know if you've seen the AI dilemma by Tristan Harris, his new talk, of course, and what he
Biden yesterday in San Francisco.
Well, and what he points out and what makes a lot of sense is that the next thing that is going to be optimized for is for intimacy. So basically basically that we are changing from social media into another understanding of social media, which is like a relation between basically a machine and human, and basically the possibilities for very, very granular monetization of private data, I guess. If you, I don't know, the question would be if you share this thought of direction or the direction that this is going. And secondly, I thought this was very interesting, the idea or the question if this AI explosion is going to favor rather more small players or maybe cement the bigger players. I think what we can see now that the internet is closing off a bit with Reddit, with Twitter closing their APIs. I think this is going to the direction that, and the GPT-4 opening or basically embedding plugins, this is already going into a direction that probably favors heavily those players that are already there. And I don't see a way how this could turn out otherwise right now, I guess.
Well, to answer that second question first, that's why the open source model, that Facebook's decision on this is, I think, quite important. Thinking about how pluralistic the economic environment is. Because, yeah, it's still the case that the generative AI market is. But, there's a reason that Google, the memo that was leaked saying there is no moat, right? Well, because they do feel threatened by open source. But it's possible that it could lead to greater competition. I do think there's, like I said, there is this feeling of a tectonic shift in Silicon Valley. And then Tristan's point on intimacy. So there's the private issue and then there's the intimacy issue, right? So the privacy issues, yes, AI does enable certain new kinds of privacy invasions, right, that were not there before. That I see as a little bit different than the intimacy issues as to whether AI, and we need to be cognizant of that and think about, how we should limit the ability of uses of AI in order to know things about people that they don't want us to know. But I also think that's a losing battle because that's not even really an AI problem right now. I mean, down the street from Stanford to Palantir, ask them any question about yourself, they will be able to answer it. Little exaggeration for those online, but then there's the intimacy issue, right? Will we be using AI, in love, in sex, as therapists, all of that? And the answer is yes, I think on that there's going to be, huge move into those areas, just like in every area of our life.
There is one aspect you did not mention. I don't know if it's voluntary, it's jobs, because that may be also another tectonic shift for political reasons and economic reasons.
So as you know, I'm telling you all probably something you aren't know already. What's really interesting, at least about the revolution in generative AI, is that it's affecting white collar jobs, not just blue collar jobs, where we usually think of automation's effect happening to working class people. And so there will be real effects. We have Eric Brynjolfsson in our shop at Stanford has a report out on which jobs are most vulnerable here. My graduates, my students in the law school are going to certainly be affected by this. I mean, I don't know whether this you all have experienced, but students are now all in on using. Try to regulate it, but they're all using it. In the engineering school at the computer scientists at Stanford, everything they do now has an AI copilot. I had the strange experience of having a student do a presentation in my class where he proudly said on a topic of, this was on blockchain and democracy, and he said, as our professor personally has written, he has a citation to me on the slide, I didn't write that paper. He didn't even bother to check whether that paper existed. I mean, in front of the professor, right? And so it'll have, like all technologies, there'll be winners and losers. In some of these areas, there'll be, accentuate our productivity. I have my research assistant right now, who's pretty skilled in this, says it has increased his productivity 400%. He says in the last year. And hopefully he won't do those missed citations that my other students did. But so I would refer you to Eric's paper on this. There's obviously a lot of looking into this. It'll huge displacement, huge impacts, I think, on the workforce. But I view that as that's a train that's.
Quick question on balkanization of internet. I was really interested how that will actually look if Florida and California have different laws on internet. We know China and Europe have different laws on internet, and so people probably use VPNs. How can Florida enforce different laws if people living in Florida want to consume internet available and for social media available in California?
Well, but that's the interesting thing about these laws, right? These laws are actually there to prevent the internet platforms from taking down stuff. So what you will see in Florida and Texas is that the internet is going to have more of content, but that the platforms don't want you to see.
But Facebook is not registered in Florida, right? Doesn't have to.
But I don't think Floridians are going to say, "Hey, I want the California version of Facebook," but they'll just see, well, why is all this stuff in my feed that shouldn't have been there, right? And so I don't see that happening. But it poses fundamental questions as to the power of individual states to regulate the internet. So take Montana, it might be a better example with TikTok, right? So you can bet there are 14-year-olds in Montana who are finding ways to access TikTok, even though the state says that they can't, right? And you'll see that. But what the companies are going to do is they're going to have different versions, and this happens in Europe as well, as you know, right? There's certain types of content that are taken down up elsewhere.
Thank you. This is just a quick follow-up on Sergey's question, but why isn't the power to regulate content online at the federal level in the US? What is in that Commerce Clause?
Good question, and that will be answered by the Supreme Court, whether states have the ability. And this is another area where they're really quite divided. I'll say, we in California have a set of laws, privacy laws, right? One that's mimicking GDPR that only applies necessarily in California, but then the platforms apply it nationally. The problem with this, with the Florida and the Texas laws, is, like I said, they're gonna essentially force Facebook to put up Facebook and Twitter to put up content that might be prohibited in other countries. I mean, as a general rule, the companies enjoy First Amendment rights themselves to decide what content appears on the platform. And so we will see whether those at the Supreme Court who otherwise have been protective of corporations' First Amendment rights are going to extend that logic when it comes to Florida and Texas laws, forcing them to keep